Good day, everyone. I am Amami Mondoyo, and today we will tackle the Lesson 3 with the title of Historical Sources. Objectives. By the end of this lesson, the students will be able to differentiate between primary and secondary sources. Second, distinguish the importance of both types of sources. Third, demonstrate the ability to conduct external and internal criticisms. And lastly, relate methods of external and internal criticism to the goal of identifying historical truth and avoiding false historical claims. There are 4 main concepts, starting with primary sources, which are historical documents that were made or produced at the same time that history was being studied. The second is secondary sources, which are historical writings created using primary sources. The third is external criticism, which is directed at primary sources in order to determine their authenticity. Lastly, internal criticism is criticism that examines a primary source's content. Historical records are the most necessary research tools for historians in the field of past history. Historical resources are only reflections of the past, like pieces of an endless puzzle. Fortunately, the historical method guides us in an appropriate way to deal with the limited evidence in order to develop meaningful and coherent historical explanations and arguments. Let's move on to the classification of historical sources. Primary sources are those that were created at the same time as the event, period, or subject being studied. For example, suppose a historian would like to examine the Commonwealth Consultative Convention of 1935. Convention minutes, press clippings, reports of the Philippine Commission of U.S. Commissioners, records of minutes of the convention, the draft of the deliberation, and even photos of the event could all be potential primary sources in this case. Delegates' eyewitness accounts and recollections can also be used as primary sources. The same can be said about other historical research topics. Documents, artifacts, memorabilia, letters, census, and government records from the past, these are the most common types of sources. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are sources created by an author who relied on primary sources to write the material. In other words, secondary sources are historical research products that other historians use for additional information or as the background to their research. For example, students studying the Philippine Revolution of 1896 can read Teodoro Agoncillo's Revolt of the Masses, the story of Bonifacio and the Katipunan, originally published in 1956. The Philippine Revolution occurred in the late 19th century, while Agoncillo's work was published in 1956. Thus, Agoncillo's Revolt of the Masses is a secondary source because it was created at a different time by someone who was not present during that period. A student, on the other hand, should not be confused about what counts as a primary or secondary source. As aforementioned, the classification of primary and secondary sources is based on the subject of the historical research rather than the period when the source was created or the type of source. For example, Agoncillo's Revolt of the Masses is usually classified as a secondary source. While this classification is common, it is not always accurate. If a historian decides to write a book about the history of Philippine history books in the 1950s, Agoncillo's work can be used as a primary source. In writing and learning history, both primary and secondary sources are useful. Secondary sources are important because they broaden our understanding of the past. But looking at these resources would be beneficial even for serious history students who do not want to become historians. However, in order to gain knowledge, be familiar with how other historians have approached particular historical topics and identify knowledge gaps that they can fill as they conduct their own original historical research. Historians who wish to contribute to historical knowledge should first have a firm grasp on the literature that already exists on a given topic. Students can gain new insights from primary sources. Moreover, it might give them opportunity to develop their own way of interpreting the sources rather than simply relying on how secondary source authors have interpreted the primary sources. Let's move forward to external and internal criticism of primary sources. Historians and students of history must thoroughly examine historical sources and evidence while studying both primary and secondary sources in order to avoid deception and come to the historical truth. External and internal criticisms of the sources should be conducted by the historian. External criticism is the practice of verifying the authenticity of evidence by examining its physical characteristics, its consistency with the historical character of the time when it was supposedly produced, and the materials of the historical source, the quality of the paper used to produce the document, the printing or copying technique, and the language and words used in the material are some of the things that will be examined when conducting external criticism of a document. External criticism is an essential process that a historian should undertake. Otherwise, he would commit the mistake of using illegitimate or fake documents. Authorship and the date of production should be established. In some cases, the historian may seek the help of other experts, such as archaeologists or linguists. Artifacts, for example, are rare finds that are often unpreserved, especially when not properly cared for. If a historian is to write history based on an artifact, extensive external criticism should be performed. The same is true with documents. Historical documents should be externally criticized for both unintentional and intentional errors. For example, before computers and copying machines, manual techniques for reproducing text were widely used. These procedures were prone to errors made by typists and scribes. Historians should be able to detect these errors skillfully. This skill is even more critical in cases of intentional errors like falsification of information, forgery, omissions, and other modifications that could have been made to documents to serve different purposes and agendas. Internal criticism, on the other hand, is the examination of a document's content. Internal criticism requires the historian to read the document carefully and comprehend the meaning that is intended to convey. Primary sources are materials that are specific to a given context and are easily misunderstood. Internal criticism entails examining the source's content as well as the circumstances of its production. It examines the truthfulness of the evidence by looking at the author of the source and their background, the context of the document, the agenda behind its creation, the knowledge that informed it, and its intended purpose. For example, Japanese reports and declarations during World War II should not be regarded as historical facts. Internal criticism requires historians to recognize and analyze how such reports can be manipulated to be used as war propaganda. It is essential to validate historical sources because using unverified, falsified, or untruthful sources and evidence can lead to equally false conclusions. Historical deceptions and lies are really likely if historical evidence is not thoroughly criticized. The hoax code of Kalantiaw is one of the most infamous cases of deception in Philippine history. Maragtas, the epic, contained a code which was a set of rules. The code was allegedly written in 1433 by Datu Kalantiaw, more than a century before Spain officially colonized the Philippines. Until 1968, the document was regarded as an important pre-colonial document and was donated to the National Library. The authenticity of the code was questioned by American historian William Henry Scott due to anachronism and the lack of evidence that the code existed in pre-colonial Philippine society. The hoax could have been avoided if historians and the National Librarian had used rigorous internal and external criticism. Ferdinand Marcos' declaration that he was a decorated World War II soldier who led a guerrilla unit called Ang Mga Maharlika was also debunked. Students of history widely believe this claim, and Marcos had war medals to show for it. When historians checked the war records of the United States, they found out that this claim was false. These cases show how deceptions can spread in the absence of rigorous historical research. Scott debunked the validity of the Kalantiaw Code by pointing out inconsistencies with more credible sources and glaring inaccuracies in simple historical detail in the text. For example, the code describes certain barbaric laws enacted by Datu Kalantiaw in order to govern his people. These laws include drowning murderers in rivers, burning them with boiling water, and feeding those who disturb the graveyards to ants. These are both ludicrous and fascinating. Perhaps this is why many people believe them without doing much research. However, Scott's investigation revealed that no credible sources describe pre-Hispanic Philippine societies as barbaric in terms of criminal punishment. Offenders were instead punished with fines and servitude. Such characteristics remain in societies that were not subjected to colonization. In addition to this, historians uncovered other questionable details in the document. For instance, the third article of the code requires a man who neglects his wife and children to swim for 3 hours as a form of punishment. Ancient Filipino societies did not use hour as a unit to measure time. As a result, it is impossible for a law to impose such a punishment. Knowledge about the ancient Philippine societies enabled Scott and other historians to criticize and ultimately debunk the Code of Kalantiaw as a legitimate primary source. They corroborated and compared the source to other primary and secondary sources from the time period. Corroboration is also what revealed the fakeness of Ferdinand Marcos' war medals. As early as 1945, Marcos claimed to have received prestigious awards from the United States government in recognition of his heroism on Bataan during World War II. These medals were the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for any member of the U.S. Army, the Silver Star, the third highest decoration, and the Order of the Purple Heart awarded to any member of the U.S. Armed Forces who is wounded in battle. The National Historical Commission of the Philippines concluded in 2016 that these awards were not real and that Marcos claimed was exploits that won him the medals were fake. According to Marcos' biographies, the Distinguished Service Cross was awarded to him because he single-handedly delayed the fall of Bataan for 3 months. Dr. Ricardo T. Jose, a renowned World War II historian, found this implausible, claiming that if such claims were true, Marcos would have received the highest military decoration, the Medal of Honor, rather than the second. Apart from this apparent implausibility, Jose also debunked Marcos' claim that the medal was given to him by General Douglas MacArthur himself in 1945. Jose scoured through the archives of the MacArthur Memorial in Virginia and found no mention of MacArthur pinning Marcos the Distinguished Service Cross. Aside from this, the alleged guerrilla unit led by Marcos, ang Mga Maharlika, was never recognized by the U.S. government, as shown in its military record. The U.S. Armed Forces denied Marcos' appeal for the recognition of his unit because of the limited military values of this duty. If Marcos' guerrilla unit was perceived as insignificant by the U.S. Army, how could Marcos be given prestigious military decorations? All of these findings were found by a rigorous examination of relevant primary sources, and multiple sources did not corroborate Marcos' biographies. These two cases demonstrate the importance of internal and external criticism of primary sources. Historians and students of history would never be able to unravel true historical knowledge without the rigor of historical methodology. Lesson Summary. Primary and secondary sources serve different functions, and both are important for historians and students of history. Primary sources are important representations of the past that are analyzed and interpreted by historians. For a source to be classified as primary, it should be produced in the same period as the subject or by eyewitnesses present in the period being studied. Secondary sources are historical texts read by students to gain historical knowledge and by historians as related texts to their research. These sources are products of historians' work using primary sources. Historians should employ internal and external criticism to debunk false historical claims such as the Code of Kalantiaw and Marcos' fake war medals.